I hope you have slept well and now are now ready and eager to talk about cultural policies. I'm Sari Karttunen from CUPORE, and I'll be chairing this morning's first session. It deals with the arts councils in the two countries, and they have been under reform lately and caused a lot of discussion. In both countries, there have been changes in the structure and in the functions of the arts councils. And we have two speakers in the session. And the first to speak is Dr. Erik Peurell from the Swedish Government Agency for Cultural Analysis, Myndigheten för kulturanalys. And the second speaker is Dr. Sakarias Sokka from the University of Jyväskylä. And we will first listen to the two speakers and have discussion after that. And each gentleman is given 20 minutes or 25. And please, Erik, to start.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here today, Mats. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope I will be able to give you some picture of the roots and the development of the Swedish Arts Council. This presentation is intended to provide a picture of the roots and development from the perspective of a civil servant. I have not conducted any original research in the field myself, in the sense of a systematic study under the influence of a scientific theory. Instead, I have gathered information from others who are active in the research field in Sweden, but also from people who worked at the Arts Council. And to this, I have added my own experience from working at the Council and at the Ministry of Culture for a total of 12 years. To give you an idea of the experience I represent, I can say that I at the Arts Council, primarily work with literature, multiculturalism, statistics and research administration, and at the Ministry, I worked during one period with issues about the Swedish language and research questions, and during another period with a group of national museums and exhibition activities, primarily in the field of visual arts. Now, I am an analyst at the Agency for Cultural Policy Analysis, which has just celebrated our second birthday, focusing on research and statistics, and I am also the Deputy Director of the agency. It's not possible to describe the emergence of the Swedish Arts Council without speaking about Swedish cultural policy in general. The Arts Council was a result of the formalizing of Swedish cultural policy in the 1970s, and the Council has since been a kind of symbol for the state policy of culture. I do not intend to give you an extensive description of the history of the Swedish cultural policy. I know others who are present here today could give you a much better presentation about that, but nevertheless, I will have to start with a brief historical background. In Swedish political life, culture has long been subsumed in education policy. It was actually not until 1991 that Sweden got its first Minister of Culture with a single responsibility for culture. Further back, among the Swedish popular movement organizations, existed from the late 1800s and onwards an idea of the significance of educational formation, given both within the trade union movement, the temperance movement, and the non-conformist religious movement. According to this idea, especially reading, reflection, and debate would create citizens who would take an active part in society, in community life. The thought that all citizens should be given the opportunity to take part of established culture in the form of, for example, literature or music or theater, became a question also in the political debate and was supported mainly by social democrats. Riksteatern was established in 1934 at the initiative of the social democratic minister Arthur Engberg. And it was a popular movement-based touring theater with state funding. Today, Riksteatern is still an important fundament for Swedish theatre and for cultural debate, and the chair of the board of Riksteatern is appointed by the government. During the 1940s and 1950s, activities of the same kind were made outside the political sphere. But from the 1960s, the politicians started to pay more attention to how established culture increasingly faced competition of popular culture and mass culture. The contradiction between high culture and low culture was by no means a new phenomenon. The novelty was that the issue was the subject of policy initiatives. The minister at the time, Ragnar Edenman, set up an action program for cultural policy in 1961 and wanted the state to pursue a policy that meant the offer of other options, other choices. This point of view has since been an underlying concern for the development of Swedish cultural policy. In 1964, an activity similar to Riksteatern was set up in the field of music, and in 1968 it was made permanent as Rikskonserter. The situation in the book market led to the appointment of a government inquiry working for 5 years between 1968 and 1973. Another inquiry was set up for the field of museums in 1965. Ragnar Edenman had, during the first years of the 1960s, also gathered an informal group of experts and prominent artists as a kind of advisory board. Minister Edenman was himself chair of this group, which was called Kulturrådet, which is what we today call the Arts Council. When Olof Palme succeeded Edenman as Minister of Education in 1967, he wanted to formalize the group, which he also made in 1969. The group still consisted of a mix of researchers and artists, but was not appointed as a committee, but was working within the ministry. In 1972, this group, Kulturrådet, presented a first official report, which was to be the foundation for the formalized national cultural policy of Sweden. The report was based on a broad concept of culture, where concepts as community, social contact, and communication were highlighted as important aspects in meeting with the culture, and people's own activities were regarded as important. When the government finally presented its bill on culture to the parliament 2 years later, in spring 1974, some of the sociological aspects of culture or cultural policy were gone. But still, community and activity was central ideas, with the freedom of speech as the fundament. A core question was decentralization, how to reach out with culture to as many citizens as possible in the country, giving them the opportunity to take part as audience or visitors or active creators, and especially to reach groups in society that was not much cultural active. Another important issue was the earlier mentioned question of alternatives to commercial culture. In the bill, the government presented 8 objectives for the state policy for culture, and suggested the establishment of a national agency for implementing the cultural policy. This agency was called Statens kulturråd, or in English, the Swedish National Board for Cultural Affairs, which was set up in fall 1974. The name Swedish Arts Council was not used until 2003. And in the following, I will use Arts Council, though it's anachronism. It's much easier to say. It is also important to note that the word state is used both in the name of this agency, Statens kulturråd, as well as in the bill, where it is written about state policy for culture, statlig kulturpolitik. The state was supposed to be guarantee for the cultural policy also on regional and municipal levels, but the objectives were explicitly directed to state institutions, state initiatives, and funding. In the years to come, the state would also coordinate and partly finance the infrastructure for regional cultural policy. During the 1970s and 1980s, regional museums, orchestras and theatres found their place in the cultural environment with more or less substantial state funding. The shaping of Swedish cultural policy continued in two more bills. 1975, the government presented a bill which contained, among other things, the proposal of an agreement on funding of Swedish film and of a structure for funding of book publishing. And 1976, there was a bill on the system for support of professional artists and making permanent organization for touring exhibition activities, Riksutställningar. Then we had finally got the three R's, de tre R'en, Riksteatern, Rikskonserter och Riksutställningar. An important focus was marginalized groups in society, such as children, immigrants, and linguistic minorities. And one aim, which is significant for the ideas of the time, was to reach people where they were, at work or in living environments. The main task for the new agency, Statens kulturråd, Arts Council, was to handle the applications for funding culture in all art areas, both regional institutions and free actors. The offices were organized in 4 units, 3 units for grants and funding in the areas art, museums, exhibitions, theater, dance, music, and literature library. And there was also 1 unit for research and development, sort of. This was a structure that was to be kept more or less untouched, at least the 3 art area units, until 2006. To all areas, the Art Council called in experts to reference groups or working groups for decision-making. The experts were artists and cultural professionals from each area, and their main function was to ensure that different artistic aspects of content, such as the always difficult question of quality, were considered in the decision-making. In all cases, these groups had an advisory function to begin with. But in practice, the suggestions made by these 3 groups often were accepted as they were by the board. No changes made. From 1987, though, the group for support to literature officially were given the right to make decisions on their own. But those were the only ones. In 1981, the Art Council had a staff of 85 persons. The unit for research and development had about 20 persons employed. They were working with statistics in different ways and with large development projects such as Culture at Work, Kultur i arbetslivet, and Culture in Residential Environment, Kultur i boendemiljö. When you read the memoirs of former employees at the Arts Council, you can feel that these first years were marked by a certain pioneering spirit. You get the impression that the direction of the Arts Council and the employees were genuinely interested in art and bringing art to the people. In the yearly request for budget, the Council repeatedly was demanding more money for funding arts and culture. In 1984, economic realities came to change the conditions for the Arts Council. A new director was appointed by the ministry with the task to make the council less the spokesman of art and artists and more a performer of government policies. The funding of the council was cut with 20%, which mostly affected the unit for research and development. A significant change was that the logotype used by the council was changed from Kulturrådet to Statens kulturråd. The official name had always been Statens kulturråd, but the council had chosen to use the more informal Kulturrådet, which still is how most people speak about the Arts Council. And from 2003, it was used again in the logotype. From the end of the 1980s, parallel to the everyday funding activities, internationalization and globalization became important questions that influenced the work of the Arts Council. Among other things, the Council took part in shaping of a Nordic group of experts in cultural policy research. Sweden was one of the first countries to take part of and thereby to help shaping the National Cultural Review Program initiated by the Council of Europe. Through the Arts Council, Sweden was also one of the first countries to contribute to the Compendium of Cultural Policies and Trends in Europe, which is managed by Erik Arts and partly funded by the Council of Europe. One specific track led from the UN report on global environmental trends presented in 1987, the so-called Brundtland report. The Arts Council was part in the discussions leading up to the World Committee on Culture becoming a reality with the former UN Secretary General Pérez de Cuéllar as chairman. In 1998, the committee presented its report called Our Creative Diversity. This took place in Stockholm at an international conference called The Power of Culture, which the Swedish government and UNESCO were hosting together. In the 1990s, statistics also became increasingly important. In 1994, the Arts Council was appointed responsible for the official statistics in the area of culture, in the field of culture. The Council produced several publications every year with statistics on different subjects as library and reading, museums and art galleries, theatre and music, heritage and cultural habits. At the end of the 1990s, cultural statistics, evaluation and research in an international cooperation formed the basis from which the strategic decisions of the Council were made. In the mid-90s, there was a new government inquiry on cultural policy issues. The bill presented in 1996 didn't contain many news. The objectives for the cultural policy were mostly untouched, but there was one small but nevertheless important change in perspective. The notion used in the bill is no longer state cultural policy, but national cultural policy. The objectives are no longer just directed towards state initiatives or state institutions, but should be applied, or at least been taken in consideration, by all national levels. I myself was employed at the Arts Council in 1998 to make a study of the implications of the use of internet and other digital means in the field of literature and publishing. During this period, the digitalization of cultural production, distribution and consumption came into focus and was an important part of the work at the Arts Council. But at the same time, legal aspects of funding and transparency in the process of decision-making got higher priority than research and statistics. The new director from 2001, Kristina Rennerstedt, had a background as a lawyer and as a state secretary at the Ministry of Justice. A lot of effort was made to uniform both the processes and the forms for applying for funding. And with forms, I really mean the paper forms. They used a ruler to measure how long you know. All decisions on funding must be followed by rationales according to specific templates. An online system was set up to ensure applicants 24/7 access to the agency. During this period, the English name was changed to Swedish Arts Council, which I may add happened without the approval of the ministry. 2009, a new bill of cultural policy was presented by the government. Behind the scenes, a radical change of the infrastructure of agency handling the public funding of culture had been proposed. In fact, it was quite close that the Arts Council had disappeared completely from the field of cultural policy as an agency of its own. The proposal suggested the merge of a couple of funding agencies, but in the end, almost everything was kept, as it were. The two most important changes were, firstly, the introduction of the regionalization of funding, the cooperation model, which we heard about, yesterday, where the state funding of certain regional institutions, which earlier were given directly to the institution, now are given to the counties, regions, for them to decide, counties, regions, for them to decide over for further breakdown. Secondly, there was the creation of a new agency, my own, very important, which took over some of the tasks of the Arts Council. Research, horizon scanning, evaluation, and eventually also statistics moved from the Arts Council to the new agency. Funding is still the most important question for the Arts Council, but under its new and current director from 2008, Kenneth Johansson, with a background as a museum director in Malmö in the south of Sweden and as head of culture in Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden, which is important since he is not from Stockholm. That is the main point here. The Council has a focus on freedom of speech, the funding of artists as a front of creative culture, and the funding of artistic development of national interest. A very important task is also to promote culture to children, primarily through the program called Creative School. To sum up, during the years, the Arts Council has been an agency for implementing the government. During the years, the Arts Council has been an agency for implementing the government's policy for culture. The overall remit and tasks for the Council have been set by the government, but the actions and decisions in detail have been made by the arm's length principle through the board and the different reference and working groups. The government's choice of director for the Council has been important for all periods. They have chosen the director from what they want out of the Council. We have seen an important reform of funding of regional cultural institutions. This is considered as a reform of regionalization with the potential to bring the culture closer to the citizens, but is at the same time described as putting the Arts Council even more in focus than before, since the Council is representing the state in the dialogues with the counties. So we are in a time where the Arts Council have a possibility to shape their own future, and today we are not really sure which way they are going. So to follow the work of the Arts Council today is very interesting, and maybe also a task for us at the Agency for Cultural Policy Analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erik. And now Sakarias, please. The stage is yours.
Thank you. I'll start really from the origins. So let's go back to the 19th century. Here. I want to start from here because I think that there really are some roots that are important even today when we take a look of the development in the 19th century. And I begin from the 1940s, because from the 1940s onwards, the political discussion of the status of Finland developed. There were many individuals who were influential in this debate, and it's also interesting in what comes to Sweden, that it was a Swedish doctor, Israel Wasser, who was inspired by the Romanticism, who started this kind of public discussion in Finland. And it continued and developed, and the thought of Finnish state or Finnish nation was already well known among the intellectuals or the intelligentsia in the late 1950s, or at least in the 1850s, or at least in the 1860s. And already in the late 1860s, there were first textbooks on Finnish history that were published. And this way, the idea of Finnishness developed. And there were many men of letters who were taking part in this kind of discussions. I guess that also the Swedish who are present here know the poet Johan Ludwig Runeberg and Sakarias who took part in developing the cultural side of Finnishness, the idea of Finnish nation, and produced, for example, new descriptions of the war of 1808-09, and it was renamed as a War of Finland at that stage. So the Finnish people started to think that it was the war that was influential in gaining the independence when they look back into these kind of situations already, kind of separation from the Sweden. And of course, also Lönnrot and the national epic Kalevala that was gathered during these times, which included mythical national heroes and descriptions of Finnishness. So this kind of cultural content was very important in the spread of the idea of Finland and Finnish nation. And these same culturally active names were also more or less involved into the politics, at least from 1960s onwards. At the same time, the civil society was developing. There were first associations, cultural associations and art associations or societies that introduced the first specialized committees, where there were experts who made decisions considering the quality of cultural products. There were the first one actually who used this kind of committees was the Finnish Literature Society, which was established in 1831. And there were also Finnish Art Society that granted stipends for individual young artists, and which was also involved in granting the public working subsidies or working grants for the individual artists in Finland. And these societies were also involved in the first state prizes for arts. The first one was already in the 1860s, and the Literature Society was involved in granting that kind of prize. And then there were also Finnish Artist Association. The Art Society was established in 1846, and the Artists Association was established in 1864. And this association promoted for better circumstances to produce art. So it goes way back, the development and the role of associations and societies in Finland. Then, of course, from nation to nation state. Already in the 19th century, the autonomous Finland was kind of in the mind of the Finnish intellectuals. It came near to independent state, and the Finnish Senate, how is that pronounced? It's had its own role, and it could allocate own funding for Finnish development. So it was really autonomous compared to the Russian rule. And there were first regular state subsidized for Swedish-speaking theatre already in 1858. And what comes to Finnish-speaking theatre, it did not receive public resources or subsidized before 1870s, even though they tried to get it from the Senate. So there is this kind of distinction between the bourgeois and nobility and the phenomens who wanted to back Finnish-speaking culture compared to the more Swedish-speaking bourgeois and the nobility. So Finnish-speaking literature and theatre had to struggle for state subsidies at this point. The Senate was Swedish-speaking and bureaucratic. And as the situation of the Finnish language improved in administration, the Finnish theatre also got its first state subsidies in the I think it was in the late 1870s. And in the Diet, the peasants usually supported the Fennomans and Finnish language. So there was this kind of distinction. So to conclude this early development, there were this national content and developing the content for cultural side of Finnishness, and developing nation state, organizing the administration at national level, and development of civil society and the first associations and societies. And I think that the root of corporatism, which is in my mind very important in what comes to organizing art subsidies in Finland, goes way back to even this development, because the role of associations and societies was so important. The early art associations gave an important impulse to the formation and functioning of the art world. So I suggest that the modern field of culture owes its historical origin to political initiatives of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So when we compare this kind of development to the Swedish development, I think there are some similarities. I don't know how much in what comes to the early origins of the using committees and expert boards in subsidizing art, but if we think that at first the Russian Empire was in favor of distinguishing the new part, which is Finland, from its old connections, which is Sweden. At first, the Russians were in favor of the rise of new Finnish publicity, which allowed for the development of liberal and Fennoman newspapers and associations. And then, in the late 19th century, Russians turned to slavophilia, and the Fennomania movement became more politicized. So after that became the years of Russification, and it was also more difficult for the associations to function. And during this development, there were struggles between language groups and different political actors. It was a question already at this point of who defines what and how, also in what comes to art. And there were the traditional Fennomans, vanhasuomalaiset in Finnish, who remained loyal to the Russian emperor, whereas more radical Fennomans, nuorsuomalaiset in Finnish, young Fennomans, and Svekomans, who were more liberal in their attitudes and also more against the Russian rule. And models for funding the arts, the first models were developing in this frame. And already at this point, I think that certain groups could take control over defining of what is good and what kind of art deserves public support. I refer to the Swedish development of associations, and I think that also in Sweden associations are seen in the development of the 19th century as an autonomous part of the structure of decision making. I refer to Clausen and Zelle, and also to Philip Wikström and Lundström, who have wrote about this development. And it means that the associations also in Sweden, according to these scholars, were acting as mediators between the state and the people, and representing the people in what comes to creating the administration and the relationship between the associations and the state. This way, the associations could form the ways things were done, and the state could give directions and favor those who supported its aims and ambitions. So it's, I don't know that much about the history of art subsidies in Sweden, but it would be also interesting to know what kind of development was going on already at this point in there. Then in the development, there were, of course, different kind of struggle, and this is important in what comes to thinking of the political side of the development. So I think that it's always a matter of using power and deciding who is taking part in the decision-making process. So that is I think the origins, and it's just to very, very briefly to take a look at where this model comes from and what kind of development was there in Finland at the early stage. I forgot to tell you that here, after the independence in 1918, the first state art boards were established. There were 5 of those for the traditional art forms: literature, visual arts, architecture, drama, and what was the 5? Music. Yeah, music, of course. Yeah. So it was kind of, they were formed according to the development that took place already in the 19th century, and there were same associations were involved in the formation of these first boards. Okay, let's start to think about, now we have the state art boards, and they were formed in collaboration with the art associations and the state administration for these 5 art forms. How did this situation develop, and what kind of changes were there? After the Second World War in Finland, there were real attempts from the leftist politicians to take action to change this system. But to put it briefly, they actually failed. So there were only minor changes. And the ministry had a strong role in nominating the members in art boards. However, also the associations remained important, and they had also a role. They could propose their own people to be nominated as members in the boards, and that's the important point. So the state asked from the associations, who would you like to see sitting in the boards? And that's been the situation from the very early stage in Finland. So in fact, after the World War, the tradition of the 1920s and 1930s remained even surprisingly strong. That means that the same individuals who were members of the boards were still members of the boards after the World War, and despite the influence that the left-wing politicians had. Then let's go to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, which is usually seen that from the 1960s onwards, this is the stage where the welfare model of art subsidies were created. So I just put these kind of keywords there that I'm going to refer. That first there was the idea of democratization of culture, which already I think Anita referred to in her opening speech, and also Esa referred to yesterday. And then the idea of cultural democracy, and then the new influence or bigger influence of markets on also art subsidies, or at least it's claimed that it might be so. So in the 1970s, there was the question of decentralization, which was raised, the question of decentralization. And the idea of public power having more influence and developing increasing possibilities for people to have access in culture. So access in culture for all kinds of people. But when we refer to the idea of democratization of culture, it is the idea that is comes from top down. So we have this kind of idea of art that is good, and we should spread it to the people who are in need of that kind of content. During the 1960s, there were also new internationalization in Finnish circumstances. When we think about the Second World War, it cut off some relations, some international relations, and then it was again growing. And the rising role of popular culture, which of course is interesting in relation to the content that the art boards wanted to pack. So this is the place where the welfare state is brought into the sphere of art world also. And here the 1965 committee, the report of the State's Art Committee, which Esa referred to yesterday, was very important. And in that report, there was mentioned, this is a quotation from the committee report, that art was, the idea of subsidizing art was introduced in such a way that we should turn from subsidizing the art to promoting it. So more possibilities to create art and so on. And in 1967, there was the big change that from these old traditional boards that were created in 1918, idea of introducing new art councils. And this meant central council which would work in a national level, and also councils for different art forms. And then in 1972, the regional councils started, and there was one in each provinces that we don't have anymore. And this system of regional councils was made permanent in 1984. So this is kind of illustrating the idea of bringing the welfare state into the art world. There were more administration and more possibilities to support, to promote the art. And then I want to refer also to the 1974 report of the State's Culture Committee. And this comes to mind when we think about what Erik told about the 1972 situation in Sweden. And this comes back to the idea of cultural democracy then, which means that there were different kind of ideas to do widening the scope in cultural administration. So in addition to promotion of professional art and artists, which was the idea of the 1960s, public resources should be used to promote also folk art and more popular forms of culture, people's cultural hobbies, and marginalized groups, meaning that the public administration should provide possibilities also for uninstitutionalized forms of culture. And this kind of thinking, of course, makes reference to UNESCO also, in particular its conventions in Rome 1967 and in Helsinki 1972, which is called Eurocult. And this is also linked to the discussion about cultural rights which is even today very influential and alive and kicking. But it's also interesting when compared to the system of the art boards, that this kind of ideas did not actually have this much influence on the way that the boards or the councils were organized. They were established. The system of art boards was changed to the system of art councils in 1967, and they were organized according to the ideas that were influential during that time. And this cultural democracy thinking came a little bit later, and I think that it's interesting to think about the system, how the art council system in Finland has developed and what kind of role it has had until now compared to this kind of thinking of culture and widening the scope of culture and thinking about cultural democracy. I don't have that much time, so I go on. 1990s, there was also one committee meeting, and I'm just showing that these kind of keywords, I think, that are included in the report, like creativity, economic impact, cultural industry, multiculturalism, and so on, which gives an idea of what kind of discussion was influenced during that days. And it didn't have that much effect on the system of art councils. Perhaps during the 1990s, possibilities to subsidize projects and productions were increasing. So that way it reflected to the world of art councils also. And then the big change that has taken place just recently, starting from the beginning of this year, there are no more art councils in Finland. Instead, there is this Arts Promotion Center Finland. And the task of the center is to promote the arts on both the national and international levels, as well as to promote aspects of culture that are not covered by any other official body. So they continue on the tasks that the art councils had, and the role of the center in state administration has changed a little bit, and the art associations were actually very concerned about whether this would reduce their influence on the system of distributing art subsidies. And we'll see what happens. I don't know yet. It's so new situation that we have to follow it, and I guess there are many people present who can tell me how it seems at the moment. And then to stop, I just raise some questions that are still and have been during all the way important, and which are very much Finnish, I think. So throughout the years, there is this root of corporatism I referred to. So the role of associations, even though they are concerned about their role at the present situation, I think it is still influential and they are important. And we have a rather centralized system. So the state is strong, and of course here we can compare the situation in Sweden, like we heard yesterday about the development of the regionalization, and heard that we don't have that kind of system. So we have the regional councils still also as a part of this new Arts Promotion Center, but if we think about the money, the system of Art Council had distributed something like 30 million euros as grants for art and artists, and perhaps something like 5 million euros of that amount were distributed via the regional councils, 13 of them. So it shows that most of the grants are distributed from national level, and if you take a look at the lists of individual artists who receive the funding, it's really concentrated on the Helsinki area. Well, that's the truth. And I'm actually a little bit concerned about that. I think that it really shows that the system is centralized in what comes to art subsidies. And we have to bear in mind that also the major national institutions are located in Helsinki. And so when the institutions get more money goes again to the Helsinki area and the artists who are working there. So that's one question, and centralization and decentralization is always a timely question. Then, of course, we have the municipalities who are really big supporters of one part of culture, and it's mostly the institutionalized forms of art that are backed by the municipalities. And this is also a good question in what comes to working conditions of the individual artists, that what kind of money is there and who is distributing it, and what kind of possibilities the municipalities will have to give support to art. And then when we come back to the idea of cultural democracy, it's, I think, very interesting to think that what kind of possibilities do we have at this point to promote this kind of wider understanding of arts and culture, and, for example, people's own cultural hobbies and possibilities to take part in cultural life and so on. So I think that's it.
Okay, thank you, Sakarias. And now we have something like 10 minutes for questions and comments. Any, Pirkko-Liisa, please. And would you please introduce yourself, tell who you are, where you come from first?
Does it work? Okay. Yeah, I'm Pirkko-Liisa Ahponen. I come from the University of Eastern Finland, and I'm just now I have a status of Professor Emerita. Yeah, I was interested in the speech of both of you about the relationship between the conceptions state and nation. And as Erik said, there has been a recent change in Sweden in the conceptualization, and also Sakarias spoke about that, for instance, how the corporatism was involved in this work of, let's say, us councils. And of course, when we think about the role of state, for instance, so that state is some kind of steering mechanism, but nation, we speak about, for instance, a spirit of nation and national identity, and then we go to, of course, nation as ideological in the ideological point of view. So how do you think about those periods? Because I see that there have been different emphasis in the use of this word, for instance, the state art councils, and this word of national art council was not so much in the use. And now when we speak about this period of also transnationalism, and I think that there is a new demand for this concept of nation just now, in some sense. How do you think about this situation? Of course, the role of state is also changing, and when we think the role of state as connection to the regions and localities, because we can see also that that the spirit of nation, it can be made useful by means of some local identities of regional sense, or those. They are also connected to the marketing of arts, of course. So this comment, but some kind of question as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pirkko. So which one of you would
well,
like to
say
answer?
Something.
Okay.
I know it's a difficult question, but I think that it might have something to do with the, if we think about the idea of concentrating on professional art and creating a model to support that kind of art world that functions as a separate sector in the whole society, and the idea of cultural democracy, which would be supporting more wide kind of understanding of art and culture. I think that there might be some kind of gap that if we think about Finnish discussion during the something like last 2 years and what has been said about art, that it's kind of, you know, post-modern crap and so on. It shows that the gap between many of the people and the professional artists is rather big. And I don't know, if we think about the regionalism and possibilities to take part in cultural life in regions, if we would have more means to create this kind of activities, I think it might be a way to narrow the gap, and this would be perhaps a way to talk about nation also in different kind of style. So,
thanks.
Yeah. As I started to say in my presentation, I have not been doing any research in this. I can only give you my own opinion, my thinking about it. And I noticed you started, Sakarias, with speaking about identity and Finnishness. And from what I have been reading, preparing for this presentation, I have not seen any signs of nation or identity in the bills or in the reports. It has just been about distributing culture throughout all of the nation geographically. So that it's the concept of nation in the geographically sense. And the change in the mid-90s doesn't have to mean anything at all, really. It's just a way of making clear that something that was between the lines already from the beginning about the institutions that was funding by the state. The bill was about those institutions and what they should do. But it was also written about the other political levels on regional and municipal level. So in the 1996 bill, they were trying to make clear that the objectives of the Swedish cultural policy was not just for the state institutions or the state-funded regional institutions, but all the culture in the whole country of Sweden. So it's a geographic use of the notion, nation and national cultural policy, I would say. Because, Sakarias, you also mentioned the centralization of, or how most of the money stays in Helsinki. And that, of course, is the case in Sweden. Most of the money stays in the Stockholm area because that's where the art centers are in all different kind of arts areas. So very many of the artists come there. And that's also why in the end of the 1990s, the government gave the Art Council the task to measure and make statistics of where the state funding goes in the different parts of Sweden. So that is still actually one of the tasks that we have not taken over, but the Art Council are doing. So they are doing it right now. When we're sitting here, they're doing a news report on that.
In that case, I would like to pose you one question. What is the role of the Arts Council in the system of cultural policies in two countries? In Erik's paper, you make well, you said that the Arts Council can be a spokesman of arts and artists, or it can be an office that implements government policies. So, are there any differences between the two countries or in the history?
Well, at least in the history there are differences. I think that the discussion was much more viable something like 30 years ago, it seems, than today. If we think about the role of the councils, for example, at the regional councils, I think that most of the resources go in organizing or administering the distribution of the grants. And they perhaps do not have that much of means to take part or raise new questions, take part in the public discussion. And, of course, it always goes like this. So in the 60s, in the 70s, political kind of discussion was much more active.
So will the new Arts Promotion Center bring any change?
Don't ask me.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that later development in political governance have made the Art Council from being a spokesman, the governance in form of objectives and following up on results has made the Arts Council a kind of office just funding and looking for where the money goes. But they are trying now, from the 2009 bill, to build up a new kind of promoting system. And there is also a new bill on literature, no, not a bill, a report on literature, the literature field in Sweden, where new tasks are proposed for the Arts Council, which is very much about promoting literature. So maybe, as you say, we're going back again to that again, not as a spokesman, but as the promoter of culture, more than just funding and following up the funds, the funding.
Okay. Thank you. We have to go on with the program. Thanks.